まったく今このビラバウね。断ってたんですよ。何をすごいだよ。どう時間しこれね、どっちも出してくるから覚えてる。この画像どういうじゃん。
And that the proper antidote to that is not the pursuit of happiness, and it's not even the existence of the individual rights that are the substructure of democratic society, but the willingness to accept voluntary responsibility for those preconditions and working to rectify them. Found in the adoption of responsibility. And it's surprising that a message that has that much weight, let's say, and that little frivolity, because there's no frivolity, let's say, in that, silences people. Can democracy survive? Well, first of all, if you ask the typical person in a democratic society whether they would like it to survive, the resounding answer to that is going to be yes. The people who are working to undermine it are a tiny radical fringe on both ends of the political distribution, let's say, with a disproportionate amount of exposure and power. And the people in the middle are lost in some sense without a uniting narrative. And a huge part of the narrative that has united democratic countries since their foundation isn't the doctrine of rights. And it's not the doctrine of individual happiness. It's the doctrine that the individual is the sovereign foundation of the polity and maybe of the cosmos itself, which is something that I happen to believe, given the important role that consciousness plays in existence itself, and that it's useful and necessary to call to people to remind them of their responsibility as sovereign individuals. And so I'm encouraging people to develop a vision for their life, to adopt full responsibility for themselves in a manner, and not in a manner that pertains specifically to their narrow self-interest or happiness, but to something that's much broader in scope, to think that each person should take on the voluntary requirement to take care of themselves, but also their future selves, because each of us is a collective that stretches across time, and whatever you do impulsively in the present merely means that you sacrifice yourself in the future, and that's not a sustainable or intelligent solution. And you want to take on responsibility for yourself and your future selves in a way that's of maximal benefit to your family, if you can manage that. And then perhaps if there's something left over in terms of your capability, then you can do both of those things in a way that maximally supports and serves the community. And for many young people, that's something they've never heard, is that we've made a very bad case, all of us, I would say, that each of these people, each person, has that sovereign responsibility, and that if they adopt it, that actually constitutes something of singular importance. And that's an old religious idea, in some sense, that each person has a soul, let's say, that is somehow a center of reality itself, and that needs to be manifested in life itself, and that if it isn't manifested, then something of tremendous understand this sort of thing a lot more clearly than you might think if you explain it to them as if they could understand. And then it gives them a series of purposeness that straightens out their life. And so my sense is the way that you revivify democracy is by remembering its fundamental insistence that the individual is at the cornerstone of the state, and that everything you can possibly do to fortify the individual, simultaneously, the individual is the eyes of the state, is that where the living individual is the eyes of the dead state, and the living individual revivifies the state. And to the degree that we forget our concentration on the sovereignty of the individual, right, the divine sovereignty of the individual for that matter, then we undermine the foundation on which democracy is based. And then people look for alternatives. They search for meaning elsewhere in extremist movements of one form or another, or they collapse into a kind of nihilism that's completely counterproductive. And so that's been my experience.
Now it is the end of the Ljubljana meeting, which was a great meeting. We have had excellent discussions, we have learned a lot, and we have thought a lot. And now I hope to see you in Paris next June. It will be a plenary session, and all of us, we shall be there. So please do come to Paris.
So this morning we had a session on the future of mobility, and we actually discussed what does it mean for the auto industry and what does it mean for the cities. If you look at the auto industry, there has never been as much change as there is today. On the technology side, with connectivity, electrification, autonomous driving, on the social domain, with sharing, more urbanization and new ways of working, and also on the regulation side, where it's about emission control and standards, and also on regulation for managing congestions in the city. So we actually covered that. We also talked about what does it actually mean for the cities? How will actually the traffic evolve if you have more AVs and individual mobility through AVs? What would be levers to actually work on getting a mitigation on traffic, and basically how to deal with heightened traffic from autonomous vehicles? What would be the impact of actually sharing more cars, of basically having smaller or basically bus-based autonomous vehicles, and actually how would you deal with occupancy-based pricing? How would you actually work as a city to make the whole modal mix work, and in the end get to a better transportation for the whole city?
We had a conversation yesterday in the dinner with Nigel Higgins on, I would say, the crisis, the causes of the great financial crisis, and whether or not we are in a situation where we could expect new major difficulty, taking into account what we have done since the crisis that erupted in 2007-2008. I have to say that the questions which were asked by Nigel were very, very stimulating. I could embark on explaining that, in my opinion, it was very much a multi-dimensional causes that we had to cope with. We had certainly the over-indebtedness that had accumulated from year 2000 up to 2007-2008, approximately 25% of the global GDP as an additional public and private debt outstanding. That was a major cause. Another cause was the new emerging properties of the new global finance system with the impact of technology, new IT technologies and globalization. And amongst the properties, the emerging properties that I could witness myself when I was president of the ECB in 07, 08, 09, 10, 11, was that the contagion was taking place extraordinarily rapidly. You know, in the old times, you would expect that a major shock here would be transmitted to the rest of the world as a matter of months or even quarters. In the new world in which we are, it's a matter of half days. And we could experience that in 08, dramatically, obviously, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And we have other causes that are also important because, as I said, it's multidimensional. But I stress that the two causes that I mentioned just now, namely these emerging properties and the rapidity of contagion on the one hand, and the debt overburdening the global economy are still there. And we, particularly as regards the level of the debt outstanding, public and private, as a proportion of global GDP, we continue to have a piling up of debt more or less at the same pace after the crisis as before the crisis. And this is worrying, and it calls for extreme vigilance, obviously, and hard work to complete all what we have done and should do, again, to prevent the new crisis, and if we have new shocks that are very difficult to predict, to prove resilience in the new environment which we will have to accept because we have a recession in the US and in Europe, or because we have geostrategic events that would be very, very shocking at the global level, or for any other reason. That's what we discussed.
Strategic mission for Europe has to care on the globalized world. That means to stabilize our neighborship, to stabilize Africa together with others, but Africa is one of the major challenges for Europe as well. And of course, to make our European values as attractive as possible in the global competition, which order is the better one.
Some people wonder why best practices in government haven't spread faster amongst the democracies. When you see, for example, that New Zealand has solved the problem of public finance, why doesn't everybody copy it? Why doesn't everybody copy the way that the South Koreans teach their kids mathematics? Why doesn't everybody copy the way the Swiss decentralize their politics? And I think part of the answer is that we don't really spend nearly enough time looking at what is best practice. I live in the United States, though I grew up in the United Kingdom. One hardly ever hears a reference to other countries' systems in the US debate on healthcare, except when somebody is making a completely caricatured analysis of the way, say, Canada does things. So I think part of what we need to do is stress the need to look at best practice so that politicians and voters become more aware that there are solutions to most of the public policy problems. We just haven't tried them in many countries. On the other hand, I think there's one other side to this that one shouldn't forget. Sometimes you'll meet people who'll tell you, well, the Scandinavians have worked everything out, and Sweden or Finland or Denmark has come up with the perfect solution to policy problems. That's often an argument people make on the left in the United States. But I don't think the solutions that the Swedes came up with in recent decades necessarily would work in a country as large and as diverse as the United States. So let's look at best practice, let's understand which systems deliver the best results, but let's not pretend that one size is going to fit all. Part of the reason for the success of Western civilization, which is where democracy began, was the diversity of systems and the competition between them.
I recently read that information is now the world's most consequential and contested geopolitical resource. I think that's right. Global internet penetration has revolutionized the information domain, and information operations, which aren't new, are dramatically expanding in scale and scope. This is a new challenge for media organizations, which are already facing a business model crisis and declining trust. Meanwhile, AI advances confer strategic advantage to those with access to lots of data. This has implications for privacy, but also for the information advantage that democracies have traditionally enjoyed.
Well, does European diplomacy exist? It's not an easy question, and the answer is yes and no. Yes, in an institutional sense, that is, Mrs. Mogherini today exists, she travels, she can deliver some messages for Europe, but I would say certainly not on the most fundamental issues of foreign policy, because the members of the European Union are, many of them, very old nation states. They have their own foreign policy, defense, security apparatus, and so forth and so on. And I cannot imagine the French diplomacy just to be second to the European diplomacy, and the same with the UK, as long as the UK is in the EU, or the German diplomacy, and I could continue the list. So, in my judgment, the best merit of the EU diplomacy is first to perhaps reduce as much as possible the differences between the various diplomacies of the member states. And this, as such, is not so bad. And also, I think the EU diplomacy can deal with some relatively secondary issues, such as, for instance, I'm thinking of the Timor case in Indonesia, that is, issues which are not at the forefront of national diplomacies, but which nevertheless can have some importance. So, to conclude, I would say that the real European diplomacy will exist only the day when the Europeans have a clear understanding of what they want to achieve, what is the identity of the European Union still to be built, because diplomacy, like defense, has to do with the protecting the identity of a political unit. And I think we have not yet reached the stage when we are able to answer this question: what is our identity, and what is it exactly that we want to protect?
They're certainly similar in one respect that Thucydides wrote about brilliantly in his book on the Peloponnesian War, that when a rising power, as Thucydides wrote about Athens, threatens to displace a ruling power like Sparta, or in the current situation, a rising China threatens to displace the ruling US, alarm bells should sound, grave danger ahead, a significant likelihood of war, real bloody war.
China's rise will change the international configuration from the unipolar to bipolar, and also possibly and make the world order and different from before. But it doesn't mean that the China's rise is the only factor to change the current international order. And actually, the Trump administration's policy is more challenging than China's rise to the current international order, because China's policy tries to maintain the order. The reason is very obvious. China benefits from the present order, and meanwhile, the Trump administration believes, and China benefits more from the current order than the United States. That's why they want to change the order, and based on the ideology of anti-establishmentism. So from my understanding, if we're talking about what the ideology and challenging the current international order or the liberalist order is anti-establishmentism in US and populism in the Europe.
I think in economic terms, it's already shaping up to be the Chinese century. By 2014, according to the IMF, China was the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity, and in other respects, China is already the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest exporter, the world's largest market for a great many important commodities such as vehicles. The question is whether that economic power translates into political power and strategic power, because I think most people would agree, probably even in Beijing, that America remains the world's dominant political power. And the question is, will that economic mismatch between economic power and strategic power change, and China will become the dominant power, not just economically, but politically? It's too soon to tell that, however, on that, because there are a lot of different variables. Will there be a direct conflict between China and the US, for example, over dominance of the Pacific? Will China perhaps be constrained by other things? Maybe there'll be internal disruption to China's politics if it cannot manage to, for example, maintain the current political stability. That could disrupt China's political rise. And finally, there's the question of the rest of the world, because between them, China and the US are not the whole world economy. Other major powers will have a say in this. And at the moment, it looks like most of the other major powers of the world, Japan, the European Union, are closer to the United States than to China. So there's a question whether China, even as the world's largest economy, can become the dominant political power without allies.
I think economic growth, the success or failure of it, will be determined by the degree to which individual countries and regions can supply jobs for the great emerging middle classes of these countries, formerly poor countries. I think what we're likely to see in the 21st century is many people who are either liberated from hard labor, or for whom there is too little hard labor to provide jobs. And what will these people do? How will they be employed? And I think that will be a major factor contributing forward. Also, even though the world population is declining, we're still in an era of massive male youth bulges in about 20 or 30 countries. And there's going to be a lot of pressure to provide jobs for people, whether it's in China, in Yemen, it's in Ethiopia, or wherever.
The main question of my talk is if robotics and artificial intelligence and the upcoming industrial revolution are a threat or an opportunity for the world and for manufacturing countries and also for developing countries. And the answer is still unknown. But what is sure now is that we have to invest in the main assets that are characterizing the Industrial Revolution, the digital transformation, competences, infrastructures, data centers, and all the tools that are fundamental and are considered enabling technologies for the future digital transformation. I also presented the differences between the US, Europe, and China, how they are integrating artificial intelligence into different knowledge and competences and scientific results. For example, in the US, they are investing very much in developing artificial intelligence for humanities, while in China they are investing in developing artificial intelligence for agricultural application, for producing food, for example. So globalization has obtained some results in terms of being socially connected, but in terms of geopolitics we still see many differences also in how the digital transformation is implemented in the society. Then I spoke about robotics and how the journey of robotics is coming into us, because robotics was developed for manufacturing countries, for industrial production, and robots are in manufacturing plants. But in recent years what we have seen is the development of service robotics, which is intended to support services and the offer of services in terms of medical robotics, social robotics, educational robotics. And now what is happening is that robotics is coming into our houses by producing some consumer products and also producing changes in the society in terms of supporting autonomous drive or different products that are revolutionizing business and revolutionizing our life.
We do have a very serious problem of people left behind. The global agenda talks about eradicating poverty, eradicating hunger, having every child in primary and secondary education. We're off track to achieve these things. And that means not just a few people left behind, it means literally hundreds of millions of people missing out. Take education. More than 250 million children, adolescents and youth not in school as we speak. How can those children and youth of the future really contribute to a knowledge economy if denied the most basic access to education? So it is time for the international community to get a grip on the reality of what is happening. If we want a world that is well fed, where people don't live in extreme poverty, where education is a right, not a privilege, we have a lot to do. International development assistance is important, critical for the lowest income countries. For other countries to be prioritising their budget so that their growth is inclusive and sustainable is critical. There are solutions. What's needed is the political will to activate and implement those solutions.
There are more than 70 million people in the world that are forcibly displaced from their homes, either as refugees crossing borders or displaced in their own country because of war, violence, discrimination, persecution, bad governance. Why is that? The world has become a difficult place where to make peace. We have become unable to make peace and to build peace. So that's the first thing that we need to look at if we want to reduce this global refugee crisis. Meanwhile, what is very important to remember is that 85% of those 70 million people are not in the rich world. They are in poor countries or middle-income countries. So the effort, and the new effort, not just humanitarian, but medium, long-term effort, founded on sound development both for refugees and for host communities, has to focus on those countries. We have now a global compact on refugees. We will have the first ever global refugee forum in December this year in Geneva. These are opportunity to rally broader coalitions of actors, not just states and the United Nations, but also the private sector, the business community, civil society, academia, to forge new ways to respond to the global refugee crisis and to finally address strategically its root causes.
The question that you're raising, will Syria find a long-lasting peace? Well, the Syrian people deserve a long-lasting peace. Think about it. They've been 8 years now in a horrible conflict which became from local, regional, and frankly international. So the answer is it must be yes. Now, how to do it is where the challenge is coming. And the only way to do it is actually to end the military conflict, because there is no solution. I mean, it's not just a word, it's the truth. There will never be just a military solution, and include everyone. New constitution, elections under the UN supervision, that would be a way to include them.
Well, I'm delighted to be able tonight to address the members of the Trilaterals and their guests. And I think my focus will be tonight on three things. One is, multilateralism has been the bread and butter of many of us, certainly at the IMF, and we believe that it has been critical in order to address many of the potential disorders of the world. Multilateralism is under threat at the moment, and I think that we have to make every effort to rejuvenate it, adapt it, and make sure that it continues to help govern particularly the economic developments around the world. That's message number one. My second message will have to do with the much more longer-term consequences of short-term policies and mechanisms, and that is really the consequences of climate change. I believe that many of the issues that we're debating at the moment will mean absolutely nothing in 20 years' time if we have not acted now in order to make sure that the planet remains something that is hospitable for our children and grandchildren. And my third message, which will not surprise any of those who know me or my friends, will have to do with inequality, and in particular the inequality that women have to suffer and have had to suffer for a long time. And while inequality as such is a major disruption, I believe that by addressing women's situation and the inequality that they face, it will help quite a way in reducing inequalities. So we'll try to do that tonight.
We're living through an era of rapid and disruptive change. That's across the board, economy, society, and what we're seeing is that nowhere is that disruption more evident than the trends associated with climate change. We're all familiar with the extreme events, the temperature rises, and the inexorable change that we're seeing to the planet's ecology as a result of climate change. But a major part of that discussion is how does energy transition and decarbonization of our energy system, which accounts for about 2/3 of carbon emissions, how will that impact climate change, and can we enter an energy transition era rapidly enough to mitigate carbon that will take us to a safe future? This is already happening. Renewable energy today is cost competitive on the grid. In a few years, renewable energy has reached 33% of capacity of global power generation. It's the fastest growing segment, and costs are decreasing rapidly. So what we're going to see is a rapid movement towards energy transition that's also going to be disruptive for the business models of today. It's going to imply new geostrategic relationships among countries as countries move away from resource-dependent fossil fuel-based systems into clean
clean energy systems, and the resource is going to become technology, and technology innovation is going to decide the winners and losers in this race.
The low carbon economy should come because to avoid the climate change, serious effort is necessary. Many of the governments are trying the new technologies, new regulations, new rules to move to that direction. But the IEA, International Energy Agency, assessed the current effort is not enough. We need much more efforts to introduce new technologies about renewables or carbon-related technologies, efficiency in a difficult sector, in the industry, and new regulations. So we need really double or triple our efforts to make it happen. One of the areas which IEA focused on is hydrogen. Hydrogen can be used to store the electricity generated by wind or solar, which is very volatile, and storage is the key element. So battery may not necessarily be enough, so hydrogen can be used. And also hydrogen can be used for steel, cement, some of the industries where the decarbonization is very difficult. So that's another area. The third one will be the hydrogen could be the new transformation for the sectors of the oil or gas producing country. If they can remove carbon dioxide from oil or gas or coal, then these hydrocarbon change into the very friendly, climate-friendly resources. So this may prevent the hydrocarbon as a stranded asset. So maybe the hydrogen is one of the key area. We need lots of infrastructure building, technologies are necessary, but hydrogen may give us a good chance to achieve the sustainable future.
The challenge of dealing with disinformation narrative is that it's not enough just to check the facts, because by definition, any disinformation narrative doesn't have good facts. They make their facts up. They're actually lying. This is why it's disinformation. So the challenge with disinformation actors is that the thing they have in common is they're really good storytellers. They tell a story that people want to believe. A lot of the time they will appeal to anger, they'll appeal to fear, they'll appeal to hatred, and they will try and stop people thinking. They'll try and get people so enraged that they switch off their critical faculty. That means that for those of us who are trying to challenge these narratives on a daily basis, it's a much more complex challenge than just presenting the facts. You have to have the ability to tell the story, and you have to find an emotion to appeal to which will actually get people to think. Now, fortunately, there is a model of story which works. If you think of the detective story, that's a story where you're putting together evidence and you're telling people, this is what happened, this is why it happened. And it appeals to a different sort of emotion. It appeals to curiosity, it appeals to problem solving. And so a lot of the challenge of dealing with disinformation is presenting the story of how the disinformation was created, how was the trick done, and you can lead people on the story and you can show them this person is telling you that here is a video of somebody attacking a voter at a polling station yesterday, but actually look, this video showed up on CNN 4 years ago in a different context. You can share that voyage of discovery with the person you're talking with, and then they will realize how the trick was done, but it will also sensitize them that the next time around, they'll be looking for that same trick. If you teach people very simple skills like searching for a photo online or searching for a video online, you can actually make them proof against that kind of reused content and repackaged content, not just today, but every time this kind of thing comes up. And so really dealing with disinformation, you have to have the facts. but you have to teach the skills as well. You have to give people the ability to solve the problems for themselves, because then you'll be appealing to their curiosity, you'll be appealing to their problem-solving senses, and you'll be appealing to their sense of pride in actually exposing the story in the first place. And those are the kind of emotions which will then counter the anger and the fear and the hatred that disinformation actors try to target.
Cities are one of the greatest innovations of all times, and what's interesting right now is that urbanization is, alongside with digitalization, a very, very strong economic force and force for innovation. As more and more people move into cities and metro areas, and urban areas were important during the industrial era, but they are increasingly important in a knowledge-based economy. And what's interesting, especially for a person like me who comes from a small city like Stockholm, is that there seem to be room for cities outside the megacities as well. There are some really interesting drivers of innovation that are smaller or mid-sized cities, amongst which Stockholm is actually one, but there are a number of examples. And what is important if a city wants to become an outlier or a hub for innovation is collaboration. If you look at urban innovation especially, you need to have a strong public-private partnership. The mayor needs to gather people from private sector, from academia and other stakeholders around the table and work together to solve problems. And I think we see that to a quite large extent right now, and I hope we'll see more of it going forward.
알았어요. 그래서 아니어도 이따가 어떤 컨트리고 그래서 얼마 시키시 야 빨리 시다야 분리 시다 가 오가 분리 시다가 서
So we had, I have to say, a meeting, a global meeting. Members of the Trilateral Commission, which was very, very multidimensional, if I may. Multidimensional in the great tradition of the Trilateral Commission by the, I would say, experiences of the members, by the sensitivities of the members, by the fact that it was, of course, a non-partisan, multi-sensitivities meeting, also because issues that we addressed were very, very multidimensional in all respect. We addressed issues that were of a geostrategic nature, issues that were of an economic nature, profoundly economic nature, issues that were related to environmental issues and difficulties and challenges. And we addressed also these particular challenges for our societies that so-called populism represent, which is also a largely multidimensional issue. So I think it was really a trilateral at its best, and also it was the occasion to confirm some dimensions and orientations of the trilateral and to make new experience, to reinforce in a number of domains our, I would say, franchise as the Trilateral Commission. First, let me mention that the Trilateral is called Trilateral because there is not only the new hemisphere, the US, Mexico, Canada, but also Europe and also Asia. And of course, the whole of Asia at a global level is more and more important. As regards new dimension for the Trilateral Commission, not only we confirmed our own values, democratic values, rule of law, human rights, and all what goes with a democratic society, but we also reinforce and confirmed our values as regards multilateralism, international cooperation, in the best sense of the term. We also said that we would like to be more transparent than we were before at the level of the trilateral as a whole, with a new initiative that we took, in particular the idea of having the display of video to sum up some of the issues that we would have addressed, and also with the idea of making known at the level of the Trilateral Commission all publications, articles, interventions, books that would be displayed or published by the members of the Trilateral Commission. All this, of course, as part of transparency and also as part of being more influential if it is possible. We also have given a mandate to the three chairs to see in which direction we could be more proactive in terms of communication, display of our ideas through various forms. So this is something which we consider very important and is one of the major conclusions of the Trilateral Commission which took place in Paris.
Hello, I'm Megan O'Sullivan. I am the new chair of the North America group of the Trilateral Commission. I wanted to take this opportunity to say a few words about the Commission and about our future. As you may know, the Trilateral Commission is a storied institution, an organization with 46 years of history of having an impact on big ideas, on bringing people together across different sectors and across three different geographies, that of North America, Europe, and Asia. But we are on the cusp of a new chapter, one that builds on that history, but really reorients ourselves and puts us in a position to make an impact in a very, very different world. And the reason why I have such confidence that the Commission can remake itself is because there is a need, and the Commission is well suited to meet that need. And that need is quite simply that in this day and age, in these political landscapes, the need is simply for more organizations, more individuals, more entities to take up the mantle of defending a rules-based order, an order that values and is committed to democratic principles, ideas like free trade and human rights. And we also have a need for more ideas to help us tackle new challenges, or certainly challenges that are new to this generation. And there are many reasons why I think the Trilateral organization is so well poised to meet this need. First and foremost, we are an organization that at its heart is a community of countries that share a common set of values, that share these commitments to these ideas about democracy, about free markets, about the rule of law. And secondly, we have a membership that spans policy, business, and academia and media. And that allows us to bring minds together and experience to bear on problems that are no longer just the purview of one of those sectors. The things that need to be thought about today and where we need new solutions and prescriptions are ones that are at the intersection of business and policy. Whether it is the contributions that private sector organizations can make to combating climate change, whether it is figuring out the ideas that will drive the reform of capitalism, or whether it is understanding the impact of technology on our systems, all of these things need business, government, and others at the table to help with. Now, of course, to realize this potential for the Trilateral Organization to meet this need, we are going to have to do some things differently than we have in the past. First and foremost, we are going to have to recognize, as a group primarily of democracies, we need to spend some time looking at ourselves, looking internally, saying what's happening with our own institutions, what is the health of our own institutions, and how is that situation affecting our ability to cooperate across national lines and deliver global problems to pressing global solutions. So we're spending more time talking about things like populism and the impact of technology on our own societies. Secondly, we've got to think about impact differently. Traditionally, we're an organization that has had impact based on the very nature of our relationships. We're an organization of people who have close ties to national governments, and often the ideas that we debate in private inform our own perspectives and inform our discussions and deliberations and conversations with people in positions of power. That will still be true, but today we need to think about having an impact on the broader debate. We no longer live in a world where governments are the only ones that can influence the future. In fact, increasingly, we have to think about other entities as being the real engines of change, and be that corporations or universities or even individuals. We need to think about how to shape the conversation, how to bring those groups in to have investment in and commitment to solutions, and we need to move ahead whether or not we're able to get our governments to agree with our prescriptions and recommendations. So in short, it's a really exciting time to be part of the Trilateral Commission. I'm deeply honored to be the new chair of the North America Group, and I look forward to working with all our members and my colleagues from other regions to realize this vision. Thank you.
So I'm Jane Harmon, and the question is, what is the future of political parties? I can speak to the U.S. more than anywhere else. I was a member of our Congress for 9 terms and left because it became so partisan and dysfunctional. At the Wilson Center, we study this, and there are some remedies to the problems. But bottom line, in the U.S., our tradition is 2 parties only. In Europe, there are multi-party systems in most countries, and we're seeing the rise of populist parties. In the U.S., we have no populist party. We have a Republican Party that is now dominated by our president, and we have a Democratic Party where most of the noise is coming from the far left. What we don't have is anything to represent the center, and that is the challenge for the U.S. going forward. That is something I work on, and that is something that the Wilson Center is hoping to improve, because if we are to convey at least a majority view in the United States, essential to making our foreign policy and domestic policy effective, we need to reach for the center so that we have both parties participating. And hopefully we'll advance that goal here at the Trilateral Commission.
The role of political parties in the political processes of countries has been always to A, intermediate the demands of society, and second, to organize the process of political competition to mobilize the population for access to power. The first objective, the one of intermediation, has been badly eroded by technology, by the social media, because people have direct access to the politicians, to society in general, to make their demands directly to the people. However, societies in the world all over are facing these days have to do essentially with the fact that governments have been unable to perform well. So I believe that the real problem is not political parties, but the lack of ability of governments to deliver in poor conditions. The governments have been unable to deliver for very obvious reasons. First of all, because it's much more difficult to govern in the era of ubiquitous information, because governments no longer have control of the sources of information, because they compete for information and for communications with the people in general. So the real problem is not political parties. The real problem is that societies in the world are lacking legitimacy. It's interesting to watch that there are a few governments in the world that know how to govern and have succeeded in maintaining the legitimacy of their systems. And in those countries, the political parties are not losing faith. So the real issue for the looking forward is to create conditions for the people to have access to the political process without undermining the legitimacy of those societies. And that's not something easy to accomplish. It'll take a dramatic effort of leadership, but not necessarily from politicians. It will take an enormous effort of society and the people to be able to create new forms of participation within which the political parties will always be important. The political parties, however, are fragmenting, are responding to the issue, the reality fragmentation of societies, and they are not likely to be the ones to lead this process. One ought to look only at the election in the United Kingdom a few weeks ago to realize that this is likely what is likely to happen. There, the Brexit party, which is not looking for power, it's just looking for an issue, was the one who succeeded. So the citizens around the world are going to have to be much more responsible in creating conditions for accessing power and for making it possible for stability and legitimacy to be accomplished.
The best way for companies to surf the digital revolution is to build trust with their customers and to build trust with their employees. One of the ways in which companies can do that is to have frank conversations with the workforce, to sit down with workers and their unions and to say, look, here's the challenges that we're facing, but importantly to ask them, how can we best get there? Because all too often, a lot of the solutions that a company can put in place that will make a real difference, the employees know the answer to that.
Multilateralism is not only the best, in many cases the only way in which you can deal with global issues, because we're dealing with global challenges and therefore you need global solutions, you need multilateral solutions. They take a little longer, yes, of course, but once you get it, then they will stick around for longer and you will get greater ownership, and therefore you will tend to have more effective solutions. The other way is that, of course,